is my colleague from Oppenheimer, Susan Shore. And we have four, really terrific panelists, which, we'll get to shortly. And each of them, you'll have an opportunity to both introduce themselves and hopefully share some really interesting, perspective on AI, machine learning, different parts of really the kind of investor ecosystem that's developing around the group. But before we go ahead and get started, I want to thank again our collaborators and really partners on this event, the EAAIH, the entire team. They've been great to work with, and really instrumental in helping to pull together all aspects of the discussion, including this panel. So I want to thank them personally. Susan, I think, has shared some slides, and just by way of just general working topic for the panel discussion, it's really kind of how AI and machine learning platforms change how we approach drug discovery, clinical development, commercialization. And our focus here, given our orientation, is going to be on kind of the business model and investment perspectives for this emerging group. Maybe next slide. And we did just want to frame just general overview here. First of all, topics we're likely to discuss will include kind of business models and technology platforms, specific applications of AI and machine learning for drug development. Schematic that we've included on this slide is pretty straightforward, but you've heard a number of different companies this morning talk about kind of where they may slot into one or more of these broad categorizations of the traditional drug development spectrum, all the way from target discovery through clinical development, ultimately commercialization. Hopefully we'll talk at least a little bit today about regulation and potentially a parallel conversation on data gathering and privacy. And then really kind of what I think is kind of going to be the heart of the conversation is just the investor ecosystem and kind of how we fund all this really interesting innovation that has been emerging for several years, but clearly has gained new momentum in the last 18 to 24 months. Next slide, please. And one of the things we did want to focus on here is really there are multiple avenues that different organizations have taken to gather significant access to capital, to fund their development spectrums, including traditional IPO. Three that were kind of referenced here on our slides of significant size, and Schrödinger, Recursion, and Exscientia, all bringing in what by any measure are substantial and successful IPOs. And then really the SPAC avenue with Benevolent transaction disclosed earlier this week. And of course, we have an interesting perspective from two of our panelists who I'll introduce here shortly on the potential role of SPACs as a structure to help fund innovation in the group. Next slide, please. And then really just the last slide before we kind of get into the discussion, just brief overview of each of our four speakers. And I think what's interesting here from my perspective is we have and Greg and David, two different perspectives on how to think about funding landscape and operational side. David and Niels both provide kind of a biotech entrepreneurial perspective, and Angela provides I think an incredible and timely perspective on the role of pharma, in this ecosystem. With that, I think if we could, each of the four panelists maybe can introduce themselves. Angela, you have the most current and topical update with your transaction today. So maybe introduce yourself, and then then we'll go on to maybe David, Greg, and then Niels.
Thank you so much for that opportunity, Kevin. So my name's Anjali Muller, and as you saw, I lead Pharma International Informatics. So what does that actually mean? It means I lead all of our informatics activities in all of our markets apart from the US. So the US I leave to our lovely colleagues at Genentech. I also, together with many of the people you've been speaking to today, co-founded the Alliance for Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare. So you're co-host today. And we kicked off, as I'm sure you've heard, in 2019 at JP Morgan. And I continue there to serve as treasurer. I sit on a bunch of other boards. And I think today I'll really be providing a lens on how is pharma viewing these sorts of investments and what are the sort of technical implications when looking at artificial intelligence in healthcare.
Great, thank you for that. And David, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, first, Kevin, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. It's a great pleasure to speak to everyone. I'm David Berry. I'm CEO of Valo Health. I've been with Valo since inception, spent about 15 years with Flagship Pioneering. Before that, started about 35 companies. And at Valo, of course, we are focused on what we see as the data revolution, which is the power of using large-scale, high-quality human data to build a new model for drug discovery and development, one that is truly digitally native and one that is vertically integrated. And in that context, use this human data foundation across the entirety of a framework in a way where we believe ultimately probabilities of success, cost points, if you will, time points can be fundamentally changed.
Great, thank you for that. And Greg?
Hi, thank you for having me. I think this is very exciting. I'm Greg Simon. I'm currently the CEO of Intelligent Medicine Acquisition Corp, which went out with an IPO on November 4th. We're focused on AI drug discovery and development companies. I've been in the speeding up drug research business since 2003 when I started Faster Cures with Mike Milken. And as I told Mike yesterday at a panel, in the old days, it was all about culture change, sharing data, involving patients, that sort of thing. Now with AI and machine learning, we actually have a chance to do more than just incrementally speed things up by moving from humans doing pipetting to sequencing machines, but actually a whole new way of thinking about the problem through AI and machine learning. And that's going to change everything.
Great, I appreciate that. And Niels?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin, for giving me this opportunity. And hi, everyone. I'm Niels Moller. I'm Chief Business Officer and co-founder of Evaxion Biotech. Evaxion is a clinical stage immunology company based on our AI platforms. My background is in medical science. I'm a medical doctor by training, but worked a few years in the pharmaceutical industry and then transitioned into AI and the intersection between companion diagnostics and AI before co-founding Evaxion. And really what we're trying to look into is decoding the immune system by looking at the various processes in the immune system. And that is, of course, a vast and a big task. So we're focusing on in three areas: cancer, infectious diseases, and then potentially companion diagnostics as well.
Well, great. And yeah, I want to start off with, admittedly, what is a somewhat generalized question, but tends to be the one I get most frequently from public market investors trying to better understand AI and machine learning, which is, really, what is sort of the working functional definition here for your specific organizations of AI versus machine learning? I mean, we kind of feel like to some degree machine learning is something that's not at all novel to either drug development or many processes. We quite arguably have entered into a different realm, but kind of really this is kind of a jump ball to any of the panelists. What is the most functional definition for either your organization or you encourage an investor trying to understand this space? One better than the other, value creation differently, but just kind of functionally, how do we work with these broad terms? I'll go ahead. And David, do you want to go ahead and you look like you're ready to go on this one?
By the way, any of the questions if that you want, I'm always happy to jump in. So let me touch on this in a couple of ways, right? Because I think part of the challenge that we've all been living with is these are terms that have become definitions used fit for purpose all over the place with a massive range of utilizations, almost like the phrase, if you'll allow me to end, which I would say in marketing these days in drug discovery can mean anything from the beginning of disease definition through approval or post-marketing to the beginning of hit finding to the end of hit finding. And I think you see that those definitions used pretty interchangeably. So I tend to think AI intellectually clumps into two broad categories. One is, of course, the stuff of science fiction movies, which is not what we're talking about, i.e. generalized AI. And then there's really, if you'll allow me to be overly simplistic about it, the statistical methodology type approaches that people have been using that allow us to advance our understandings using computational tools. But I think the easiest way to think about it is this is that next framework of statistical methodology. It's more advanced than what we've had in the past, but at its core, it's math. And it's using data to be able to draw extrapolations that are based on that data and using these insights where we can actually take it to the next level. Where I think it gets interesting is when you get into more of the active learning phase, where you can start thinking about these systems that get smarter on their own, where they can use progressive data to continue to do refinements, continue to, if you will, accelerate themselves. And the reason I put it that way, I don't think anyone gets really uncomfortable when they think about using a Bayesian analytic on the back end of a data set that's been drawn out of, say, cell culture. They also aren't willing to assume that it's going to change everything. And I think it's important to recognize what we're dealing with is exactly that, and that there's huge opportunity that comes from it. But just by using AI itself, that in itself, I think is an advancement, but it does not change the entirety of the field as a single term.
Makes sense. And maybe Greg, can you share your perspective here as somebody who's, actively managing a process of, evaluating, potential partners? Do you perceive, one term is having, AI and machine learning having, greater kind of, potential credence with, the folks who are investing with you, and kind of, how do you kind of parse this out when you think of, how to translate the value a company may be producing to, a story, so to speak, that may be more readily digestible to a broad public market audience?
Well, not being a technical expert myself, I start with some basic English sentences. Number one, if we have 7,000 diseases for which we have no therapies, and we have a good year of approving 50 drugs a year at the FDA, you're not going to get there from here if you don't change everything about the way we do drug discovery. Now, a lot of people confuse AI and ML, and a lot of people who think something is AI, it's really ML, machine learning, and not really a qualitative jump. It's a quantitative jump, so to speak. But the key thing for what we're trying to do is, well, first, we have the head of quantum computing and AI at Google X, Jack Hidary, who is very helpful in helping us figure out who's really using artificial intelligence and who's using formula-based Excel spreadsheets, which is a very different thing. But if you're trying to create a whole new way of doing business, the terminology around AI and machine learning is really important. For instance, training. You have to explain to investors, what does it mean to train your engine, so to speak? It's like training your dragon. You have to explain what it means to do something that's not just a library search function at a high level, as compared to a more human cognitive approach to combine things that ordinarily you might not think of combining. Because if we do it right, and by right, I mean we just don't put all of our biases into the training engine. If we do it right, AI will not have a confirmation bias that humans have. and it will not have blind spots that humans have. And it won't give up on things before it tries the way humans do. When you think of the serendipity that led to the discovery of penicillin and the structure of DNA, machines don't really do things by serendipity, because to them, the serendipity doesn't exist. Everything exists at the same time, and they're trying to figure out what matters to what. Humans tend to throw things away that can be very valuable. And that's just a function of our bias. So from our standpoint, the only way we're going to get to approving hundreds of drugs a year is if we change everything about the process, and we do it now in this decade. We're probably already behind China in a lot of areas, and the government has really not kicked in yet the way it did with something simple like semiconductors, where we created Semitech to put together pre-competitive information to help everybody do semiconductors better. We're going to eventually need that with AI engines and machine learning. The government's a long way from thinking about that, but I'm hoping if the Biden administration does the ARPA-H program, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, that putting forward and moving forward some of the technical requirements for true neural networks and AI will be really helpful.
That's an incredibly valuable perspective. And I guess, one of the, relevant benchmarks for the investment community when I tend to speak to, our clients and kind of, the validation components here is the role of pharma as a collaborator and ultimately as a source of, validation that, I think a broad cross-section of investor audiences can understand. And Anjali, maybe you can provide, a general perspective, and I guess, specifically the Roche Genentech team generally today announced, I think, what's a pretty interesting and important collaboration, both for, the company, but also for, everyone listening and for this meeting. So perhaps, a little bit of an overview of the perspective of what was attractive with some of the work that was going on in Recursion that caused the team at Genentech to be interested in stepping forward, and then more generally, how does pharma kind of see the profile of the collaboration between what are largely startups in the AI machine learning field and a more traditional drug development organization.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Kevin. And I think it had components in it, so you'll have to make sure that I hit each of them as I give my answer. So for anyone on the call who doesn't know, before the 1st of January, I was actually at Bayer. So I would also look at, what were the things that made the Bayer Leaps Foundation also invest in Recursion, and what has been the aspects of a company like that has made them so appealing, where we've seen struggles with other similar companies in this space. And it's really not rocket science. I think a lot of us have seen the same with other new therapies. I like Greg talking about genomics and proteomics and cell and gene therapy. Kevin and Susan, we talked about in the prep session. It's a new technology. And so what do you look for when you're trying to decide if you're going to invest in a new scientific advancement? You look for good publications. You look for what are those pre-competitive collaborations that they were getting involved in. You start to then make sure you're doing due diligence. And I know that this exists at all the companies speaking here. You bring in your technical experts to come in to sit in those pre-competitive projects, to make sure that they're looking at those publications, to make sure that as much as possible, they're looking under the hood of all of the companies that you're starting to think of investing in. And then that when you do something of the size of the deal that I think we're all delighted to see today, that you're able to do it in a way which, yes, is stage gated, but is also something where you have enough confidence to know that, yeah, this is the company, this is the one, and I expect that to have a return.
No, it's interesting perspective, and I guess just sort of maybe building on that, and I think this following question could be interesting to a portion of the audience, and that is, collaboration disclosed today does identify specific, therapeutic, areas that will be at least the initial focus. And I think it's somewhat difficult for those looking at a company very much for arm's length to understand necessarily how specific, AI modalities may be better or less well suited to given, traditional, clinical therapeutic, areas. It's a little bit more of a challenge than, thinking about an antibody platform in CNS probably not being the perfect pairing here. I think there's some knowledge gaps for us all to fill in. So perhaps you can, help provide us some additional perspective.
Yeah, I think, again, Kevin, I certainly hope I don't disappoint the audience today, but I won't go into too many specifics about this particular deal we announced today. I would say that you're absolutely right. When you are looking at a marriage between two companies or a strong partnership, then you do have to say, we're not going to go into any disease area. As much as Recursion's not going to go into any disease area, Roche is certainly better poised to move in some disease areas over others and has specific strengths. And so I think what to specifically look out for in a company that is strongly using artificial intelligence is what sort of data sets have they acquired? What sort of past partnerships and long-term partnerships with longitudinal data sets have they made, and in which therapeutic area are those data sets really rich in the phenotypes, in the genotypes, in the proteomic data that is really relevant for that disease area. So that's a little bit of just sitting down, doing that history of what sort of data sets do they have, and really understanding that as you're doing that due diligence, those data sets are very real assets, particularly if they're rich and they're longitudinal and they have some sort of exclusivity attached to them. I think that, though, the other component of your question, if I understood you correctly, is there something inherent in the models that would say this is for this disease or this is for that disease? I think that in terms of other areas where we look at diagnostics, for instance, there are differences between what we would look for in drug discovery and what methodologies we'd look for in drug discovery versus in diagnostics. But in drug discovery, and I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists look like, we're looking at many of the same methodologies. The differentiator is really in what are the data sets going in, and then what is the validation approach that this particular company has taken.
And then maybe picking up on that, Niels, you are front and center on a kind of full stack biotech AI integration model with some clinical data. Maybe a perspective that you can provide on really two questions. First, you have clinical data around AI driven therapeutics. Talk a little bit about how you are able to apply that clinical data and kind of a learning feedback loop. And then, you're kind of building on to some of Anjali's point, your perspective on, how you, from a longitudinal perspective, kind of are able to, to measure, the metrics of efficiency in your algorithms and, on the platform.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Anjali made a very important point on the data. I think in our experience, it's the quality of the data. People think about, apply AI to massive data sets, and that's of course one approach. But I think in our experience, it's also really thinking about, the quality of the data. How do you make sure that you can actually generate the data that addresses the thing or the issue that you want to handle with your AI approach? And that's, in many cases, a very time-consuming a task, and it can also be a task that requires a lot of different competences actually to make sure that if you go on the journey to generate the data, does that data really address the issue that you want to solve when you apply your AI engine around that? So I think that's an important point. I think also when you want to test different hypotheses or outcomes of your data. You need to have sort of the next step in mind. How do you bring this potential prediction or the outcome of this predictor forward? Is it, for example, just target discovery? What do you want to do next in the value creation chain? So I think it's important also to have the capabilities to do the next step to test your predictor or the outcome of your predictor, have a standardized way to do that. Because if you rely on the feedback loop that you can actually establish, and which I think is one of the benefits of applying AI in the drug discovery approach, that you can build that feedback loop where you make sure that you do it in a standardized way. So what you test is also, what you can use to retrain your technology. I think that's important to have the setup around the AI, the outcome, the testing, and ideally also having all the way into the clinic and a setup where you can use the clinical data, and there you have human data. So you need, in that situation, also have the possibilities to standardize that data and have a predictor really that can handle real human data, which is not mouse data. So that also has some challenges on the technology side. So you need insights to all of those steps ideally, so you can make sure that the initial work you do on building your platforms can continuously be improved once you start having access to clinical data that you can use for training purposes.
We have a couple of questions that have come in. One of them, to each of the panelists, how do you think about data ownership and regulation around this fundamental understanding of data ownership and AI? Dave, I'm going to take you up on your prior comment that you are eager to comment on many topics. I know this is one you have a strong perspective on.
I don't have strong perspectives on anything. I don't know why you would say something like that. No, sorry. Look, I think data ownership is a super important topic. I mean, first and foremost, I think we would all agree that data is essential to making models, and I know that's sort of just a general truism and probably the least useful thing I could have said. But what extends from that is high quality data is essential for high quality models, and breadth and differentiation of data becomes a very important component of that. And part of what's happened, right, is that we have a whole set of different data sets that exist around the world. People have, en masse, chased after data sets that happen to be large. They don't happen to necessarily be high quality. They happen to have two features, I guess: large and available. And in the canonical form, or I'm not going to say anything interesting of garbage in, garbage out, we know what we get, right? The reality becomes, how do you find those very particular high quality, high density data sets? How do you get the right sort of access? And how do you preserve patient privacy at the same time? And the reality is, as long as one has the right lens, this is a very solvable problem. Of course, the data frameworks that I just described is exactly what we're focused on at Valo, those high quality, high density human data sets. But ensuring that there is, of course, HIPAA, GDPR compliance, that's the starting point. We have to go deeper because, of course, we all know when these data sets get dense, there is an ability to go back and, if you will, violate the limits of what you're supposed to just because of the density of the data and re-identify patients. That's not any of our intents, right? But I think this is one of those opportunities where we as an industry, we as a collective can take leadership, have to define leadership, have to take that leadership and put in not just the rules and the regulations and the policies, but also make it such that the operating methodologies prevent it. And these are not hard things for us to do. We don't need to re-identify patients to be able to develop better drugs. It's useful for selling toilet paper, but we don't need it to develop better drugs. And I think that's something that we have to embrace, and we have to be very much in front of. And part of the reason I'm leaning in on this, Kevin, is I think we've all seen in the drug pricing battles, pharma has basically been made into the sort of the scapegoat, where everyone's looking at drug pricing being driven by pharma and not, of course, all of the other players in the ecosystem. And I think one of the things that's important is we as a collective take leadership and take ownership and take control of the data narrative, and not let the perception of risk because others in other industries have not respected patients. It doesn't mean that we won't. And in fact, it's because of that that I think we at Valo, we in other parts of the industry have taken this so seriously and are making sure we're going above and beyond to ensure that patient confidentiality is fundamental, it's foundational, it's something that's built in, and that if it doesn't get done on an industry level, I mean, how do I put it? We are happy to take a leadership role and make that happen.
Anyone else want to jump in on this topic?
Yeah, I wanted to, that was excellent, David. Patient health data has migrated considerably. Initially, electronic medical records were only for billing. That was their real purpose. It was totally commercial. And the patient was in the position of owning their data, but never seeing their data. It'd be like owning a house and never having the key to go in the door. So you could walk around the house and you can look in the window and you can see, oh, there's the edge of my dining room table, but you didn't have access to go inside. Then the industry let you in the foyer. Oh, we're going to give you summaries of your data. Well, no, I want the whole thing. And in fact, when I was with the Cancer Moonshot and Vice President Biden was asked by Judy Folkman from Epic, why do you even want your medical records? He said, none of your goddamn business, which is the right answer, because the people who aggregate your records have no business asking you why you want your own records. So now we've evolved to where these records are digital, available, and valuable. So companies like Tempus, Flatiron, and others are using millions of patient records. The patients don't know those records are being used. They're de-identified. They're being used for good purpose to identify ways in which a provider can provide better care, but the patient involvement is still very minimal. And the next evolution will be patients demanding micropayments when their data is aggregated to create a valuable product. This is going to happen in the consumer world as well. Netflix, Facebook, and others are not going to continue to be able to use AI to take your data and monetize it without sharing something with you. This will happen, and it will be a micropayment system, and I predict it will happen in the next several years. So then you get to this really critical point of how do we use data to help people and at the same time respect their interest in their data, either monetarily or ethically. And there, you know, even the companies that do it well do not do it with patients. They do it with institutions. Only research foundations like Count Me In at the Broad or the Million Veterans Project at the VA actually involve patients in getting involved with their records and being part of longitudinal studies. So imagine the Framingham study, which was a direct-to-patient study back in the day. And now we're doing 1,000 Framingham studies, but just with the data and never talking to the patient. Real-world evidence is going to require that we combine millions of patient records with a lot of patient-reported outcomes and data. And that's going to be a challenge because most data companies have nothing to do with patients directly. They view that as messy. Well, it is messy, but it's crucial.
And then, yeah, Anjali, maybe you can provide a little bit of the ex-US perspective on, on the topic, or, at least a little bit more of a global perspective.
Yes, thank you so much. And I must say, I did say this before, whenever I join an AAIH panel, I usually find I'm giving the ex-US perspective, but I love hearing the US perspective because in some ways it is quite different. And as I said, I cover all of our markets apart from the US. So the US is covered by Genentech. And if I give you an example of the UK here, where the National Health Service, of course, has all of the electronic medical records and they're all government owned. I think it'd be interesting to see whether or not the arrival of micropayments in the US will influence anything in the UK, where you have this highly centralized government run setup, and that they already have spin out companies like Senzyme, which has a 30% investment from the National Health Service. So 30% of Senzyme belongs to the National Health Service, to clean up all of those electronic medical records and then make them available to pharmaceutical and other third parties for research. So whether or not that model will ever be disrupted by micropayments is interesting. I mean, I would just say and take the opportunity to say +1 to David. As an industry, we have to show that we're not going to make the mistakes of other industries, that we're going to take this very seriously. And it looks different in different countries. What I see is mostly patient groups. So I work with a lot of NGOs and patient groups, and I also sit on the board of a charity for rare disease patients called RareX, are really reaching out, looking for support to have their patient-reported outcomes collected, integrated with electronic medical records, integrated with genomic records. I also see a lot of governments are reaching out. They're asking for support from private organizations to try and clean up all of these data sets, to make sense of these data sets, to look at complicated confounding factors as we see during the pandemic, but as we also see in other aspects of healthcare. I think that perhaps from an investment perspective, the interesting thing to ask the companies you're looking at and investing in is, do they understand what are the technologies that can help them overcome obstacles that might be caused by certain data sets lying behind different firewalls? Because there are technological solutions to these challenges, and to ensure that you're compliant with local regulation and that you're not starting to make patient data re-identifiable. So there are ways to make sure that that's not happening. There are approaches in differential privacy, and you can start to test that in the companies that you're investing in, just to understand, is there a hidden risk in this company because they don't understand what is the right approach to protect patient data and to respect the regulations in place to really ensure that we're not exposing somebody's data in the wrong way.
And I think, the series of comments here, feed into a topic that I do get questions from investors with some frequency on, which is, from the investment community side, we're somewhat accustomed to seeing these cycles of, expansive access to capital, a lot of entrepreneurial development, and then sort of a somewhat typical consolidation phase. I'm not here to say we are anywhere near necessarily the consolidation component of that scenario, but I think that's a pretty time-tested, cycle. So, what is sort of the role of consolidation here? And because it's a really interesting question. When I get on the phone with a traditional healthcare investor, there tends to be a sense that consolidation is this long process, and maybe you want to own, quote unquote, the target in consolidation, because that's where you potentially make your near-term return. And when I talk to my colleagues who tend to be more oriented towards classic technology investing, they all want to own the consolidators because, first mover, scale is kind of what wins the day typically. I'm not sure where this all plays out. You're all deeper in the trenches. So does anyone want to, comment maybe on the following two questions? What might consolidation sort of look like? And is it ultimately healthy healthier for the stakeholder position that you hold, each of you, to have, fewer companies of greater scale, or are we all better served with these more kind of fit for purpose business models that currently tend to typify the companies that we see?
I'll jump in on that. Not from a company perspective, because I'm not running an AI company, but from a capital markets perspective, which is why we formed our SPAC. It's hard to consolidate an industry if everybody's private. It's also hard to get public investment in private companies because the millennials and the boomers are obsessed now with health. and investing in health. And there was an article just this morning that is the volume of private investment that is making it difficult for a lot of companies who are public to get investments. We have got to create a public market ecosystem for this new industry. And it should not be limited to investors in private companies who, as you know, have to be very wealthy to do that as individuals. So our whole purpose in starting the series of intelligent medicine SPACs is to create a public market ecosystem that allows consolidation in traditional ways using public stock as currency, but also opens up this field, democratizes the investing in this field to the public. And they can't do that in the private sector. And when you consider there are at least 250 companies that say they're in AI drug discovery or AI health, and there are only 5 or 6 public, you have a real mismatch between the importance of this sector and the ability of public markets to participate. So we view what we're doing as both creating part of the ecosystem, helping companies that are leaders become public so they can lead the consolidation, and making this whole sector available for public investment, because this is a crucial ESG investment, if you want to think of it that way, because what could be more important than changing the way we develop therapies if we're addressing 7,000 untreated diseases and plenty of other diseases where we have insufficient therapies. They keep you going, but they don't cure you. So from my perspective, this industry is ripe for both consolidation through democratization.
I might add, and actually before I jump in, Anjali, I feel like I have to say, I don't want this to be a provincial panel, so I hope we all can give global answers on this and be treated as global and be viewed as global representatives, if you will. Sorry, I just had to go there. But as we get into this on consolidation, I view that there's 2 conversations that get confused, right? And one version of consolidation, and let's call out what investors usually mean on that, which is there is a phase where in the beginning of something, there's an overfunding and companies get wiped out because they did not get over the threshold. And that consolidation is really, I mean, when you say consolidation in that context, it's a euphemism for cleaning up, if you will. Well, often consolidation in the technical term, of course, refers to things coming together. But let's go away from the euphemism for a second, because there's a different dynamic that I think is more important, which is that there's 2 types of companies. And this is really simple in a way, right? There's incumbents and there's innovators, which isn't to say that people in incumbents don't innovate, but they're different types of companies. They're different types of companies. An incumbent has the benefit and the curse of an existing business. And by having an existing business, it has to feed and care for that existing business. And there are certain things that if it does, and God forbid does wrong, right, it can harm the existing business. So that's why people focus on risk tolerance and things along those lines. Whereas the innovator has the fundamental benefit and curse of having nothing, right? It's the benefit because you can go anywhere and you're not damaging your existing business. And this is the curse because you don't have an existing business. So you don't have billions of dollars of revenue a year upon which you can build. But what happens out of that is 2 very different substrates get built, right? The core of the incumbent is to take the existing model and work in the context of adjacencies. And intrinsically, incumbents like working with adjacents. And it is what it is, because it's a way to slightly grow in a horizontal fashion without taking on demonstrable risk. What innovators have the opportunity to do is to build something that deviates markedly from, if you will, the standard that exists today. And that requires, if an innovator wants to reshape a market, wants to do something new, that innovator has to be able to do it at scale. And that requires a very different intentionality. And this gets a bit at what Greg was talking about, because in order to be able to scale, there has to be enough capital to be able to scale. And that can come in the form of investment. It can come in the form of revenues. It can come in other forms as well. But it's really important to be able to live into that future, into that future vision. And it's when you can mix that innovative vision plus the right sort of capital, if you will, that these innovators can become dominant companies. Now, might they buy other companies? Absolutely. Might incumbents buy other companies? Absolutely. But I view that as sort of an accelerant on behalf of these incumbents and these innovators, as opposed to a downsizing or a consolidation. But I think this latter phase, when we think about innovators and incumbents and what they do to bring a concept forward and make it into reality, is really important. Both are important, both are critical, but they're very different.
And Niels, maybe your perspective as an AI-based biotech is, do you see opportunities to bring in-house certain AI that versus basically more of a kind of buy to build versus decision, perhaps from the perspective that you have, but can you provide the biotech perspective?
Absolutely. I think that seen from our perspective, basically starting with drug candidate, bringing it into the clinic, I think our way forward is showing that it works in clinical development. Then at that point, maybe opportunities may exist at the earlier stages of development. But I think we're looking more into sort of the patchwork of technologies. If we want to leap forward, in developing the companies in new areas, I don't think we plan to do it in-house. There are other companies that are sort of young, trying to solve medical issues, and I think we need to be open to innovate together. And I think we're seeing that a lot of new companies are really good at doing that, sharing the data, and making sure, that the way that what we collaborate around is shared in a way that makes the collaboration possible. So what we see is, accessing new technologies through new innovative companies. For example, we talked about the GDPR issues, that actually there are companies that can allow you handle patient-sensitive material with new types of technologies. So I think if we're open to what are there of possibilities of working with new entrepreneurial companies that are willing to share their knowledge and share their information in a way, that it's doable, so we don't step into these other areas, but really make it synergistic, then there are a lot of possibilities. And I think a lot of young companies are actually, have that understanding. So I think, with AI and, it goes all the way from the discovery and again, back to David's comment about we have this golden opportunity also in terms of regulators. And I can say on the European side, the EMA is looking to find guidance through young, innovative companies on what they should think about AI in drug discovery. So this is a golden opportunity to actually, provide those solutions into, decision makers, regulatory bodies and payers in the end. So we have to be open about not only what's going on in your own company, but also how do we work together with potential other companies that can help us solve the medical issues about getting new drugs out to the more than 7,000 different diseases that Greg talked about that are not addressable with new medicines. So we need to be open to that, and that is just, in our opinion, much easier when it's small, nimble companies.
Great, and I'm actually going to turn some of the discussion over to my co-moderator, Susan Chor. Susan?
Niels, that was a really great segue. I actually want to talk a little bit about regulation. So there are guidelines that regulate software as a medical device, and I think it's really unclear in drug development. Maybe starting with Anjali, how is regulation on software for drug development today? What are some of the things that regulators do look at and don't look at? And what do you think the future has in store for us in terms of what will be under regulation?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question, Susan. And And David, just before we moved on, I hope that it was clear. It was just that I was enjoying learning from Greg about the US. So I know that we have a global audience, and
I just couldn't help myself. I couldn't help myself.
That's okay. I just get so excited from learning how things work within the US, and was enjoying that. So Susan, on the topic of regulation, I mean, I think this is the big difference I see in the two areas I operate, where we have the diagnostics, of course, as well as the medicinal development, so the drug development. And the diagnostics component, as you said, heavily regulated, and the same with the clinical decision support, or at least clear guardrails as we see machine learning enter those markets. In drug development, we don't have that same level of regulation, so at least not in the preclinical space. And I don't see that that's changing. I think what is going to be interesting is you're putting together a TPP, so a target product profile, is to really be able to show that that's robust scientifically. So not from a regulatory perspective, but really, if you're saying, I haven't done these animal studies, right? And I am actually using and modeling human data, as we've heard cited a few times. Can you show that in a way that is significant? Can you show it in a way that is convincing in your target product profile during your drug discovery process? I think what we will see coming under regulation is then as you start to move into the clinical space, as we already do. So if you're going to start to generate synthetic data sets for your placebo arm, or if you're going to start to say, look, I don't need to do these studies because I can then extrapolate the results. And we already see instances of this, particularly in the rare disease space, being possible. Then I think those are areas where regulations are constantly under development and will continue to be.
Thanks. And maybe David, as somebody who's up and coming in the world, what are your suggestions on what needs to be regulated versus what doesn't need to be?
So first, I have to thank you for calling me up and coming. I've been having a moment because later this week I'm hosting a panel where it's effectively the old person's panel. So I feel bad. I feel really good being in an environment where I don't have to be the old person anymore. So much happier. But look, I mean, I want to build a bit on what Anjali was saying, because I think this is spot on. The regulated environment in which we work is a very thoughtful and a very well-intended one. And what's interesting, right, is the medical device world in the context of AI has had products that have been powered by AI and similar such computational type tools and delivered things to the market. And I think it's 24 or some odd times thus far. And so the regulations, of course, have come across because a series of companies have put requests into the FDA and other regulatory bodies. And I think there's been a great dialogue that shaped what I think is a thoughtful set of policies. Now, when it comes to drug discovery and development, one thing, of course, we have to remember is, in the form of a drug, at least in the form that we know drugs where we sit today, the drug is the drug. And yes, there are tools, yes, there are techniques, but the drug is the drug. And the FDA, first and foremost, has two jobs: safety and efficacy. And what they care about is safety and efficacy. And in my experience, anytime one brings a strong scientific argument about a better, a more effective, a thoughtful way to prove safety and efficacy for the benefit of patients, the FDA is wide open. And I would say from our purview, the sorts of discussions we've had the opportunity to have with the FDA are very consistent with what I've seen in the past of looking at really good science and doing things that are very thoughtful. So I think in the context of being a younger company, one of the things that's great about it is it gives us that flexibility and that opportunity to understand just what might be possible using AI, using other approaches for the benefit of patients, for proving safety, for proving efficacy, for expediting clinical trials, for finding ways that we can try to match drugs and patients better.
We are coming up to time. I just wanted to give the panelists, last couple minutes to say whatever you would like to leave the audience with. And then I believe we'll wrap up after.
Maybe I can quickly leave mine. So I think, first of all, do feel free to reach out. So you can reach me on LinkedIn if you find these conversations interesting and would be interested in continuing them. So I'm here also very much representing the host as the Alliance for Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare. And for those of you who'd be interested in gaining a deeper understanding of how we work together within the Alliance to really shape this space within healthcare, that's something we'd be more than willing to continue the discussion on. I think today it's just a great day, seeing the Recursion deal announced. And I think it's just a sign that this is just a great space to be in. So just being here today, being as part of this event, it's just a sign that you're really in a very exciting space right now.
Anjali, I wanted to tell you that we have a quote from Marty Chavez in the deck for our SPAC, where I heard him on an interview say that when he was in college, his professor said the future of biology is computing. And this was before that was a common idea even. So I just want to say one thing about the whole AI space. It's going to change a lot of things. It's not going to change everything. And one of the things that won't change is our culture. So we have got to figure out how to involve patients as drug discovery becomes more and more technical. The analogy I like to use is we used to mine for gold, and now we're mining for Bitcoin. Very different mining. And the AI revolution is going to make it possible for us to find value where value didn't exist before. And the best partnerships we can have in that are patients. So that's why I'm very excited about what David is doing, because he has, as he puts it, very rich and very deep human-centric data, which AI and machine learning can help turn into gold. I'm very excited about the deal that was announced today, because I think that's the capstone on validating where this is all going.
I'll build on that, because I think there are interesting times, and I remember distinctly about 10 years ago, a colleague of mine made a comment that being in Boston at that time was like being in Florence during the Renaissance, i.e., it was clearly emerging as the epicenter, and things were just moving in exciting ways. And it so happens to be that was right around the time that Moderna was founded, which I can get into, but that's a whole side conversation and I won't distract with that. But I feel that we're at a very similar point in the context of AI. I don't know exactly where it is, because this is the power of digital. It doesn't have to be localized, but that we're right at that interesting tipping point where AI and the power that it has in drug discovery and development and beyond is coming into the heyday. And it's great to see all sorts of things happening in a marquee fashion, because it speaks to where we are. Of course, there's still have a lot of promise that we have to deliver, but this is that time that I think we as a community, we as an alliance have the opportunity to, and have the obligation to take that leadership role and define that future that we want together. Because I think if we look at ourselves in the room, we know there's an inevitability here. The rest of the world, I don't think does yet. But recognizing that there is this inevitability and that we are sitting in the virtual Florence, that means we have to figure out what are the rules of the road, what are the frameworks by which we are going to make this into the future of the industry. And I think that's something that we can do together. And obviously that's what the Alliance is here for. But I think we have a special opportunity to take it to the next level, and a calling and a recognition now from which we can step on a bigger soapbox and make it much more of a reality.
Maybe I'll say from the small company side, certainly it's become easier being an AI company now than it was 14 years ago. When we went to bio, healthcare conference 14 years ago as an AI immunology company. That didn't get us a lot of meeting, honestly. That changed some years ago, 5-6 years ago. Something happened, and I don't know what it is, but everybody wanted to hear about AI in drug discovery. And I think it was a tsunami rising, and I think we're still riding on that. I think also it's important to sort of acknowledge that, you know, the dramatic change in patient outcome will not come tomorrow, because there is in many ways sort of a natural process in how you get to a better outcome. You know, you need the data, the right data. It can take time to access the right data and the right quality. So you need to think about that. In order to make, you know, a real change, you need to have the right data and the right quality, and that very often comes with some time limitations. You know, you cannot just invent that. So I think eventually, you know, we'll see a huge impact, and I think we're already seeing that. But sort of the holy grail of just eradicating disease, think about the data that you need to be able to access and generate before you eradicate all 7,000 diseases that are not yet eradicated.
And that's why I love having Neil's perspective against my Wall Street mindset of, you know, everything needs to be solved in 30 seconds or less. But, you know, one of the things that I think is unique here that we should all be aware of, and it comes through in each of your comments, which is, yeah, every time we have stepped forward in innovation, there needs to be, you know, some organizational principle on how we manage that sort of new knowledge. And in prior iterations, at least in the seat I sit in, those have tended to be very private company driven and often adversarial. I mean, back to, you know, human genome, you know, forward, you know, there's been multiple, we sort of have tried to succeed through adversarial, you know, approaches. There's clearly a different tact, and I think the AIH plays an important component in that. So, you know, I think it's, you know, from the investor perspective, I think there's an opportunity here to get at some faster trajectory. I'm not sure what that trajectory ultimately looks like, but directionally faster through, you know, the voices that we're hearing today that are, you know, organized in a manner that, you know, ultimately do want an industry that develops in, you know, a healthy sort of functional ecosystem. So hopefully the investment community has an increasingly important role to play there, and it'll be a constructive role. With that, I want to thank again each of the panelists, and I think we've run a couple of minutes over, but it was a very interesting conversation. So thank you all.
Well, thank you.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good day.
Okay, I think, thank you, Kevin, for the panel.